Hey readers and writers, I'm Adrian Buskey, and you're listening to Fictitious, a podcast about the storytelling craft of science fiction and fantasy. I'm joined today by Kat Howard, the award-winning author of the novels Roses and Rot and An Unkindness of Magicians. Her latest book is a collection of short fiction called A Cathedral of Myth and Bone. These stories explore mythology, fantasy, and horror as they twist through the lives of women and saints, where the seeds of ancient revels and dread spring up anew in the modern age. A Cathedral of Myth and Bone is available now from Saga Press. And Kat, welcome to Fictitious.
Hey, thanks so much for having me here today.
A challenge anytime I do this is writing a concise little description of the book that I'm going to talk to somebody about. Short story collections are just like an utter disaster then as far as figuring out how to talk about them and sum them up. But I think yours with the Cathedral of Myth and Bone, this collection really has like thematic elements that run through it. It does feel like it's a concise piece, even though it's, you know, all these different parts that are not related to each other.
Oh, good.
And I like that. I like when you've got something that has like a unity of tone. I love short story collections, but I tend to prefer the ones that are a singular author going through them rather than the anthologies that collect a lot of different writers together, because then you get more of a hodgepodge of quality. And here we get your sort of unadulterated point of view filter through all these different stories. So I guess like first off, I want to talk about is just how did you choose the stories for this collection? And because they're collected from, there's new stories in it, but also things that you published elsewhere. Did you know as you were putting those stories together that they were sort of a unified theme? Or is that something you were discovering as you were approaching making an anthology?
We knew when I was talking to my editor, Joe Monti at Saga, about putting the book together, we knew that we didn't want to just turn it into a collected short fiction kind of thing where we just, you know, picked favorite stories or threw everything in or anything like that, because we very much wanted to have a theme, like you were mentioning. And the story that we started with was Once Future, which is one of the new pieces in the book. I had written the novella, and it was sort of like, well, what do we do with this? And Joe was like, I think it's time that you have a collection. Because I started in short fiction. The first piece in Cathedral, A Life in Fictions, was actually my first short story sale, my first publication. So you get the very beginning up until the latest stuff. So I started to look at, you know, the stories that I had written that I was very proud of, that had really, I'm proud of everything I've written. There's nothing that I would, at least at this point, consciously undo or unwrite or anything like that. But we wanted to make something that felt, as you said, thematically whole, that had some kind of tone to it. And so I looked at things, and there's always been sort of that theme in my work of I like to retell different stories. I love mythology. And for me, the stories of the saints, hagiography, sort of fit in with that. And so I was able to say, well, if I'm gonna retell King Arthur, then let's retell everybody and throw in, you know, let's see what we can do with this. And so that's sort of where the collection developed around. And then once we knew the theme, the title popped into my head, and it was one of the few times a title has ever stuck. And didn't get changed by marketing or anybody else. I was so excited. And so that made it actually really easy for me to pick through and see, okay, yeah, these are the stories that will work here.
I think it's interesting that you mentioned titles like that, because I think your previous book, An Unkindness of Magicians, has one of the best titles that I've read in recent years. Also, an incredible cover treatment and stuff, too. It really pops on the shelves.
Oh, my gosh. Yes, Lizzie Bromley, who's the art director at Saga, and Vault 49, who are the artists who did oh my gosh, genius. I'm so lucky.
You said this one you came up and you were just like, okay, I know this is what I want. Did Unkindness have to be kind of developed out over time?
Unkindness had a different working title. I had this really fun, archaic verb that hasn't been used in like 400 years. And I was like, this is a great title. And Joe would just sort of shake his head, you know, because he's known me for a while and he knows what I'm enthusiastic about. And he also knows what will sell. And so he would just sort of nod and be like, yes, let's turn in the book now. And then he was like, you know, we really can't do that. Damn it. But I love collective nouns. And so this was let's find a nice compromise here. Let's pick a weird new collective nouns for a bunch of magicians. And that was fun. And so that, you know, once we settled on that one stuck. But I was just like, man, this is why we have editors, folks. They keep us from being too weird to find our readers.
I love that you talked about using an obscure word as part of your title there, though, because if there is Let me say that one thing that I noted reading this collection is that you have a very distinct writing style, a very distinct sense of language. And I felt like this was something I was about halfway through, and I told my wife, I was like, I already feel like I could pick up your fiction without your name on it and know it's yours.
Oh, that's awesome.
I think that like it doesn't take long to kind of recognize the Cat Howard way. Not to say that like, you know, your stories don't have different feels to them and stuff as they go along, but there are signature touches that I feel like are yours. One of those touches was use of really interesting words that I didn't know and had to go look up in the middle of the story. I'm embarrassed to say I did not know what hagiography was, you know.
That's totally cool.
But once I learned it, I was like, oh, that's such an interesting word. This idea of the study of saints, but then also in other usages, the sort of elevating people to the status of saints. And a little bit later in this interview, I do want to talk about sort of a triptych of stories in the middle of this book that that kind of touch on similar ideas but the Saint of Sidewalks in particular that has that element that is both about saints and about raising people into saints. And so I thought it used the two definitions of that word very, very well.
Well, I'm just delighted to hear that. Thank you so much.
Yeah. No, and again, like I think that there are some writers that their particular sense and style stands out. And with yours, it is, again, it's using language in ways that I don't see other people use. There are times where you take a noun and make it into a verb in a way that I think really describes a moment very well. And every time I would discover it, I'd be like, I have not seen that done before. And I really like that. So again, a very Cat Howardian way of doing things. And you also tend, at least in this collection, to have a really heavy sensory exploration, to really lean into scent and taste as a way of experiencing moments, and your methodology of describing how something smells and often a sort of like a chaotic clash of two different kind of ideas together in order to create that sensory experience. I thought that was really powerful and very unique. Is that like a conscious choice, like a thing that you're doing, like, you know, a style that you've discovered that works for you? Is it something that comes out in the first drafts? Is it something you labor over? Like, how does that come together?
It tends to be, it's definitely a choice for me. After a while, you do something, you learn what you're good at. And I know that I'm good at language. I'm good at playing with words. I'm good at thinking of descriptions. You know, so if I'm having difficulty in a story, I write the easy bits first. I sit there and say, okay, let me ground myself fully in this scene. You know, what does it feel like? Where is this character? What do they hear? What do they smell? What do they taste? All of that stuff. And those details can help me as a writer move forward through the story, but they help also for the reader to ground them, to pull them in, to make things interesting. And I like words. I like words. I like language. I read a lot of poetry to clear my brain out. It's very much the fun part for me to see what I can do with the words on the page.
I've heard like Brandon Sanderson. Well, I've heard Patrick Rothfuss talk about Brandon Sanderson as describing Patrick Rothfuss as saying that there are language writers and there are plot writers, and definitely
not a plot writer. Oh my God.
Well, I was gonna say it's very clear you are a language writer, and I think short stories are great ways to explore ideas and themes, and then also to kind of refine that sense of language and figure out like what flows best for you.
Absolutely. I think the other thing about short fiction too is you can be weirder in a 3,000 word short story than you can be in a 90,000 word novel. And it's not going to alienate your reader. You know, so I can sit there and say, I am going to specifically do this weird language thing for the purpose of this story. And, you know, like I said, 3,000 words, that's fine. I'm probably, you know, people are probably going to stick with it and be willing to follow that weirdness throughout. Whereas doing that for the length of a novel is probably not going to be successful.
In challenging readers, you know, there are people who like challenging fiction. I like well-done challenging fiction. I like breezy fiction sometimes too, depending on the mood and the talent of the person putting it all together.
Absolutely.
But like you said, you can make a reader work a little harder in 3,000 words, you know, if they're already along for the ride, particularly in the middle of a collection, because you know that they know that it's short so that they'll get to the point quickly.
Yep.
And also that if it doesn't work for them, they can bail out of that story and go right to the next one, and no harm, no foul.
Exactly.
It's something that I notice in general with writers, both, I mean, people who are prolific novel writers, but also short stories, is that there tends to be ideas and themes that they explore often. It's like, if you look at like a Stephen King, you can see that there are very specific themes that he follows over and over again. If you look at Neil Gaiman, he's got ideas and explorations that he hits, here and there. I think as a writer over time, you might start to find, oh, I'm doing that thing again. I'm taking, an idea, but you're examining it from different angles. You're going through different POVs. You're turning something around. And I feel like writers are often just never quite satisfied with what they find each time. They have to do it again to keep looking at it. It feels like this is a collection that kind of is in that. So I want to talk about what themes you were finding those things. Like you said, I mean, it was deliberately constructed, but as you were writing some of them, were you finding that unconsciously you were hitting certain beats and trying to figure out what those things were to you and what you wanted to discover in writing them?
A little bit, yeah. Like I can definitely say that some of the things that I have, those shiny bits that I like to pull apart and look at over and over again. As I said before, I'm really interested in retelling stories because I'm really interested in what I feel like it got left out of the story the first time. When I look at a myth, when I look at a fairy tale, when I look at something and say, okay, I'm going to do this here, I look for whose voices didn't get to speak that first time around, and I say, okay, well, let's look at this story from their perspective. I've always been interested in saints and holiness and religion. And, I did my dissertation on how to write someone into sainthood. So the fact that you were talking about that idea of how to lift someone up, how to turn someone in there, I'm so happy that came through in the fiction as well, because it's something that I've been fascinated with from a number of angles, that sometimes turning someone into a saint was just figuring out how to tell a good story about them. That's something that I've always been interested in. I'm very much interested in consequences for magic and power. And so that's something that I play with a lot too, is what are those consequences? Who has to bear them? So, a lot of that just got kind of smooshed up and turned into stories.
Something that I saw a few times in it, again, explored from very different directions, but I don't know if there's a good word for this. Maybe there's something that maybe there's a fantastic obscure word that that I don't. That there are a number of characters in this collection who deeply want something, but they don't know precisely what that thing is. And if they go looking for that something, the results, you mentioned unintended consequences earlier. I think that there are several of the women in this that are in a deep need for something, but it's not identified, and they kind of go running towards an answer without having known the question. And those results are very complicated and surprising and often abrupt. Is that like a thematic that you saw yourself exploring? Is that something you were kind of aware of in the writing?
It's definitely something that now that you phrased it like that I can see. That one wasn't as conscious of this is what I'm interested in talking about. But I think a lot of that is just that pulls from parts of who I am as a person, in that sense of the feeling like sometimes you want something so much and you don't even know what it is. You can't even articulate it. It's just not this. It's out there. It's something new. And so that sort of quest for whatever this isn't, and how that turns into story for good or ill.
Again, this is one of those advantages of short fiction, because most of the time you read a good book on writing for long-term prose, and one of the questions they'll always say is what does your protagonist want, and
right.
what are they going for, and how do you keep them from getting it for as long as possible, for
right.
delayed gratification, and I think in the short story format you get that chance to look at things from characters who do not yet know what those things are but charge headlong into them otherwise. So again, kind of a benefit of the methodology. We've touched on this a little bit, but my favorite stories in the collection are kind of front loaded. There's sort of a triptych of stories right early on. It's the second time I've said triptych, and I don't think I ever used that word in conversation, but but it's The Saint of Sidewalks, Maidenhunter Beast, and Once Future. And you mentioned Once Future is new for this collection, and
yes.
it's a novella. And I was struck by something going into this, is that most of the time when you read a collection, if there is a novella, it's usually the anchor at the end, right? It's the finishing move of the novel. And here, Once Future, I believe, is the fourth story in a 16-story collection. And so that's a different kind of choice in the way these things are usually constructed. So right off, I want to know, what was the thinking in putting a longer piece in the early middle?
It wasn't so much about length. I knew the two anchor stories. I knew that I was starting with A Life in Fictions and that I was ending with Breaking the Frame. And those two choices were very much, this is where I start, this is where I end. And so then I just sort of kind of looked at the stories that I thought I wanted to have in and where I wanted to put them, and just sort of moved things around until it felt right, to use an extremely technical term. And One's Future wound up early.
Is that something when you were talking to the editors and going through it, to like, was there any like conversation there? Like, is this how we want to manage the flow of it? Or is it like, was everybody on board? Like, this makes sense. This is where the stories need to happen.
It was very much once we decided there was a collection, I'd check in with Joe, but he was very, very supportive. Like, he was like, yep, this is what we're going to do. Perfect. This works. Let's go, and just kept things moving forward, which was really nice.
Well, the Saint of Sidewalks, the one that comes off in like the second batting position of the order here, and to use sports metaphor, I don't know where I'm going with anything today here. But that one still probably holds up as my favorite. But I feel like whenever I read short stories, and there are a number of writers that I have short story collections that I revisit often, and I tend to discover that my favorites in them change each read. And I actually think that's a wonderful thing about the form, is that you discover something new each time, and there are opportunities to see things from a new angle if you revisit a book a couple of years later. But The Saint of Sidewalks has this idea of a city where people do kind of worship saints, and they put out these sort of effigies and offerings to the saints in order to be rewarded in some way, some kind of answer, some change in their life. And the main character of that story tries to do that, but as I said, is kind of unclear. She just needs an answer, but doesn't know her question, and gets herself saddled with sainthood in response.
Yeah. Boy, is that not fun.
No. And I thought that The Saint of Sidewalks really works as allegory for fame and notoriety. It works very well as allegory for a world that we have now where a lot of people, whether by choice or not, suddenly get thrust into a broad awareness. And that comes with adulation, but it also comes with ruin and vilification as well. And to be a person who doesn't have their own stuff figured out to suddenly be the object of other people's questions is really, really interesting.
Right. Could you imagine what you would do if you suddenly like, oh, hello, now you have this fabulous power? Surprise.
Yeah. It's interesting because, like, if you put yourself in front of people in any way, I'm sure that, like, I mean, you've been a published author for a while now. And if you go to conventions, if you go to any or readings or something like that, you're going to get people like me coming up and asking you questions about stuff. And suddenly you have to be an authority on something.
And I still haven't figured this stuff out. Like, how do you be a writer? Well, you put the words on the paper and you hope they come out okay. I mean, that's like a vast oversimplification, but at the ground of it, like that's what I've got. That's what I can share, part of the story very much was, the idea of what happens to you when all of a sudden your life gets bigger than you were prepared for it to be. But it was also, like you said, this is something that I've thought about for a while from a number of angles. One of the saints that I worked on in grad school was Joan of Arc, who most people have heard of. And she was incredibly well known in her day, just incredibly well known. Like, if there had been tabloids and Instagram and everything, then like she would have been huge. And so it was that same kind of thing where she thinks she has this holy mission and this is her thing that she's doing. But like, she'd go to towns and people would like crush up to her, asking her to touch them and bless their children and everything else. And like, this is an 18-year-old woman, and that's what she's dealing with. That and liberating France, like, like there's, but, just, and so it was that sort of, how does this thing, having this calling, having this responsibility, like, how do you go to the grocery store when that happens to you? Basically, that's what this turned into.
I love your summation of that, because I mean, that is every time that from growing up to the era of like watching people like throw adulation at like Michael Jackson or something and crying when he would step forward, to being an adult now watching kids worship Kardashians or pop stars or people worshiping presidents and stuff like that, where like that switch off of like seeing a person as a person, seeing them as an answer, or seeing them as the culmination of what it is to be successful and human and beautiful and relevant. That thing that like that when you think of yourself as a rational, critical thinking human being, you're like, I'm not like that. And then, of course, then you meet your favorite writer or somebody someplace and you find yourself suddenly a blithering idiot. And you're like, oh, no, I'm just as susceptible to it.
Exactly. And that it works both ways, that there is an actual person behind that polished avatar of success and, whatever that is, too.
Well, it's why the cliche of never meet your heroes is out there, because you never know when you catch the hero on the bad day and you get the wrong version of them. And that can be pretty soul crushing to encounter that.
Right.
The next one following that was Maidenhunter Beast. And that was definitely a story that takes this idea of the unicorn and the mythical hunter in this cyclical kind of idea. And cycles again kind of appear, these ideas of cyclical myth. Like Saint of Sidewalks and Maidenhunter Beast have an element to them where I felt like they could have existed in the same world. There's even kind of a moment late in Maiden where I was like, I almost felt like the character from Saint of Sidewalks was hovering around in the background somewhere. And I was like, yeah, I get that. This is like the Cat Howard shared universe right here. I'm into it.
There we go.
But then into Once Future, clearly a play on Once and a Future King, because it is about Arthur, but it is much more about Morgan. And it is about the idea of stories that have not had finite endings and how they cycle through our history, and how, a group of people on a college campus are seeking one to see if they assign those same roles to them, if they will fulfill those story roles sort of automatically without even being aware of it. And then in turn, trying to discover if the story can be tied off, if the weave can be finished. So as kind of like the big piece in the book, and where did that idea originate from, and how much fun were you having playing with Arthurian myth?
So much fun. I love the Arthurian legend. It is one of my favorite stories. It's always been one of my favorite stories. And from when I was super small, tiny cat, watching The Sword and the Stone and trying to be Merlin and pack everything up really small, or have a wizard's duel with Mad Madam Mim, who is actually the best. But I also remember, even when I was very, very little, and I don't know if it was we were watching The Sword and the Stone or if we were watching the musical Camelot, and that's why this Once Future opens with both of those touchstones. And my mom telling me about how when the Kennedy administration was in the White House, got referred to as Camelot. For some reason, that was one of those things that just sank its hooks in me, even when I was really, really little. This idea of giving a story that happened in America, super far away from where King Arthur was, in recent versus way, way past history, that was history rather than probably mostly myth, but trying to tell the same story and making the pieces sort of fit there. And so it just got, even before I thought that I wanted to write, even before I wanted to do stories, I grabbed up every single version and retelling of King Arthur that I could get my hands on, and just kind of watched as, what showed up in what story and how did you use that. And for me, there very much is this sort of cyclical feeling about that story, that it is a story that it likes to show up. It likes to be retold. I'd been kind of trying to write something Arthurian for a while, even again, and so when I finally made Once Future work, I was so happy.
I think it's fun when you have a story, like you said, that people have reapproached, retold, changed a few details, messed with names, explored a different aspect of it, that, you do end up with a mythology that morphs and changed. And when it's most strongly related to the foibles of humans, also it becomes the easiest to apply over and over and over again, because we continue to be this same dumb idiots over and over again as people repeating those same massive mistakes over and over.
It's the same hope-craving believers.
Because we're all, again, looking for that shining knight, that amazing sorceress, that answer to all those questions, because those answers do seem to be so out of reach so often, but yet they seem so much closer. So maybe they can get us there.
Yeah.
I loved a few of the things that you explored in Once Future. In particular, it's a small piece, but a reference to the fact that Merlin is really kind of a one-trick pony. He's just really good at that one trick. Yeah. And I liked this idea that you have the quintessential wizard, maybe until sort of Gandalf and then Harry Potter shows up. But you know, so you have Merlin, but then you have Morgan Le Fay, who's as a sorceress has a much broader overall ability set and has a much greater impact on that story than necessarily Merlin and his illusions. And so I thought that was an interesting thing. Was that something that like part of your own discovery and reading stuff? We were like, wait a minute, I think this guy's kind of a sham. It
wasn't so much that I was that it was a specific dig against Merlin as such, although he's good at the going backwards, and he's but it was more once you get into some of the really old strange stories, Morgan is not mentioned. She's not in there as some kind of seductress whatever. She is there because she is incredibly powerful wizard. The term that gets used is necromancer, which meant more that she just sort of knew magic when they were originally writing, rather than she was like out there wandering about raising the dead and stuff like that. But that she was incredibly powerful. And I think that gets lost in a lot of the retelling. She gets sort of shoved to the side, and, she's somebody's wife or somebody's mom or somebody's sister. And not that those things are bad things to be. Those things are great things to be, but just the transformation of somebody hugely powerful into somebody who mostly just shows up to stand on somebody's arm really kind of bothered me. And so I was like, okay, I'm going to switch this. Morgan's going to be like this. She's going to be the power, and Merlin's going to be the afterthought.
Well, I think we've seen over and over again as stories go through different eras. You can see the power feminine get diluted by writers who either found that to be distasteful or unrealistic, or in some way or another they wanted to elevate male characters over the female.
Sure. So we all make our storytelling choices. Easy for me to say.
Particularly, we see there's eras of our own science fiction and fantasy from the 20th century where like female characters and their agency is just sort of washed out in a massive way. And that damage is being repaired in the current age by a lot of really powerful writers. But those things are still prevalent. They're still, a massive problem in the backlog of our stories. Like so many things that we have to address, and be aware that we have classics that are wonderful stories and yet have massive problems with them. And reapproaching mythology is a great way to explore that.
Yeah. Plus also it's fun.
Yes. I mean, and in the end, like we need stories, we need fiction to be both, right? Like we need it to be entertaining, we need it to take us somewhere. The best stories are the ones that gives that flight of fancy, and at the same time wheedle into the back of our brain and teach us something, or at least make us look at something from a different angle. I want to talk about your writing and construction process here. Okay. Short stories are a very different animal than long form fiction. And so most of the time when I've talked to people about those things, they find that their approach can be very different. Do you find, as you were approaching all of these short stories, and you said you start off as a short story writer before your longer pieces were put together, when you're doing short stories, are you doing them as a pantser, as an outliner, some combination of the two? Like, is there a methodology, or is it just happening with each one?
I pretty much am never an outliner. Even for longer fiction, I'm totally a sit down at the desk and write one incredibly bad, horrible zero draft that's just, who knows what's going to come out? I don't know. We'll see. It'll be some words. It won't have a plot. And then I'm a very good reviser. And so that's where a lot of the technical structural work, as long as I can get enough on the page in that first draft to know what this story feels like in my head, to have the emotions present, then I can revise it into what it needs to be. But yeah, the first drafts for me are pretty messy, and I tend not to have plans or outlines. For longer pieces, I will, when I go back and revise, outline what I want to have happen in the revision, because then I know what the story needs to be. And so, okay, you can't just have people emotioning at each other for 50,000 words. Some things actually do need to happen. Let's think about those. Yeah. And so, and a lot of times for me, a short story, some of the speaking bone that's in there, like, I was reading something and thought that the name of a bone was really pretty. And I was like, oh, I'm going to write a story about bones because these words are great. And like, I just like it. That was basically a one evening story where I just sat down and I was like, I'm going to do this weird thing with pretty words. And so, for me, that's part of the fun of short fiction. I can do something a little bit looser and more experimental like that. That's based off of, just a really small, strange idea.
A common refrain in fiction advice is to enter the story as late as possible or enter the scene as late as possible and leave as early as you can while it's still satisfying. In short stories, I feel like, because one of the benefits of that particular type of story is that you don't necessarily have to explain everything. You don't have to belabor the point. You can get in and get out. But choosing your bailout point, where you find that the story is satisfactory, where you think that it will give the reader as much as they need without taking it a step too far. I think that's a delicate balance. It's a difficult choice to make. As you're approaching the ends of those stories, I mean, was that something you had to consciously take into effect? Like, where do I end this at? Or is it more like this is as much story as I had to tell, and this is where I check out?
It tends to be, for me, like the first way you're describing it, figuring out where you end it. Do you have enough? That sounds very smart and like a very good idea and totally foreign to how I write. Like I'm like sitting here over at my computer going, yeah, oh yeah, that's good. That's good right there. Think about that. And for me I'm sure that there is sort of a back brain process going on when I write, but it is for me very much a back brain process. And it's that, does this feel like I have finished the story? And so if I can feel like I have finished the story, then I wrap things up.
Is back brain process a Cat Howard phrase, or is that from somewhere else? Because I don't think I've heard that one before.
I feel like I've heard that around, like things like it's sort of like a back burner. You got your thing cooking on the stove that simmers for like 12 hours or whatever. That's sort of how a lot of writing things feel like to me. There's always something in the back brain.
I like that. I always think of it as I always call it a background process, much like a computer kind of thing.
There you go.
And the background process tends to erupt revelations and ideas at weird times, like when you're in the middle of conversation or washing the dishes or something. I find that leads me to exclaim wildly and startle my wife and dog when those moments happen. I don't know what that looks like for you, though.
It tends to be, I keep a notebook by the bed because there tends to be a lot of bursting up in the middle of the night with, this is just figured things out for me. And also eyeliner to scribble on the bathtub walls if it's if I'm stuck and I'm doing it on purpose, I'll usually bake something. I do a lot of this is enough of a different task. I'll just go over here and make a cookies. And then like halfway through cookies, I'm like, that's what that character needs to do.
Plot baking. I like it. Yeah,
yep. Procrastination baking. Yep.
Productive procrastination is a big part of writing. And I think people don't understand it, that it doesn't always happen just sitting down and staring at a screen. Sometimes you have to let the things percolate in the background.
Yep.
What are your tools of the trade? What kind of software do you use? You mentioned you keep a notebook. Do you do other by hand writing?
I write everything by hand first. I have a large pile of notebooks, a bazillion pens of different colors, some fountain pens and some inks, because also it's really important that the story get written in the right color. I don't know why my brain does that, but it does. And so I draft everything by hand. And so the first thing that goes into the computer is actually usually a first level edit. And I'm so basic when it comes to the computer. It's Word, because Word is easy and Word doesn't yell at me and it doesn't crash. And usually until I'm trying to do track changes for my edits, but that's a different story. For a science fiction person, I really don't like technologies. They scare me a little. And so I do most things old-fashionedly.
It doesn't surprise me that you would be obsessed with color as, when it came to ink and what story it is, because like I was talking about earlier with like the sensory elements of your writing, color seems to be a frequent thing as well. I mean, right, a lot there was scent. I mean, there's a lot of color choices that I feel like do kind of give a certain tonality to the story or represent the moods of the characters and stuff. So that was clear to me.
I and my large pile of pens. Thank you.
Do you ever switch in the middle of something? Do you have to I'm just curious about that sort of like writery obsession. Like is there a moment where you're like, oh no, this passage has to be in something else?
It's usually not passage to passage. It'll be like yesterday was this color and today's going to be that color, or edits are in a different color, or this needs to be edited in a different color, or it's whatever I can hang on to make myself feel happy about the writing. It's all good.
And then when you are not actively writing and when you are perhaps not hiding from technology, what other media and stories are you putting into your brain right now? Like what kind of stuff is influencing you or entertaining you or distracting you when you need those procrastination moments?
I've been on a big vampire kick lately. So lots of gothic, lots of vampire, lots of, Guillermo del Toro and Crimson Peak and Dracula and all sorts of just dark, creepy business, which is probably going to show up in a couple books from now. I have this feeling. The best book I read recently, which is I think it's out very, very soon. I don't know when this is broadcasting exactly, but G. Willow Wilson's The Bird King. She is an amazing, amazing writer, and this is this gorgeous set in 15th century Spain during the Inquisition, and it is beautiful, and I cried through the end of it, and it is a wonderful book that everyone should read. I listen to lots of music, Florence and the Machine and all sorts of, women with big voices and strange lyrics. I'm probably going to be listening to it. And when it's not snowing and disgusting out, I like to go for a run to get that sort of outside, there are actual things other than books kind of feeling.
Yeah, I do worry when I see writers describe like their life as being very insular and inside and just always, reading and writing. And it's like, being out in the world is important too. Sensory experience is important. New ideas are important. Being around other humans. I'm a big extrovert, so being around humans is rejuvenating for me, but I know that is not the case for a lot of other people. And so, but it's still important. You still need a little bit of exposure to the other humans.
And if you go outside, you can meet people's dogs when they're walking their dogs. And I highly recommend walking dogs.
Yes. So. More time with dogs, I think, in general is good. I am not surprised by your talk about the vampires and stuff, because I did see you on Twitter refer to yourself as sort of a casual goth at what point.
Yep, pretty much.
Which, looking at you here and hearing you, you don't sound very gothy or moody or dark, but...
Oh, no, I need to fix this.
There's some image control to be done here if you're going to adequately pull off the gothiness, but yeah, so that goes right along. I will have to look for G. Willow Wilson's book there. I have not heard about that one. I know her work from comics.
Right. I know her first novel, Aleph the Unseen, I believe it won a World Fantasy Award. It is just, stunningly good. And obviously her comic work is genius. But man, this new one, The Bird King, is just like, if I had to pick a top 5 books right now, it would be in my top 5 books. Do not ask me to pick top 5 books because I will completely lose all ability to think.
Well, I would never be able to answer that question, so I will not ask it of you either.
Okay. It's one of those where someone asks and you're like, books. I've read books.
I live in a perpetual hell of giant to be read piles. And so I know the things that I love and I know the things that I've loved recently, but then trying to quantify them in any way sounds like a Sisyphean task that I will not undertake, and I will refuse should it be asked of me. So I respect your choice there. Kat, as we finish up here, tell the audience where they should be finding your work, where they should be following you, how to keep up on updates, how to know what's coming next from you.
Okay, well, the most recent book is, as we've been discussing, Cathedral of Myth and Bone, found in fine bookstores everywhere. I am on Twitter as Cat with Sword, same on Instagram. Also, you can find me writing comics over for Vertigo at the Books of Magic. That's a more ongoing thing. You can find that once every month. My next novel-length project is called A Sleight of Shadows, which is the sequel to An Unkindness of Magicians, and will be out in June of next year.
Well, awesome. So, like we said at the top, A Cathedral of Myth and Bone is available now, like you said, in the fine bookstores everywhere. And if they don't have it, they're not fine, damn it. And they need to rectify it.
But they could order. They're very nice.
Yes. Bookstore people are your friends. And books are very available. You can get them these days. So yes, go out and find that work. I have not yet read An Unkindness of Magicians. It's been on my want to have it pile. And so as soon as I am not knee deep in all the books I'm reading for the interviews I do for the show, sometime in a season break, I'm going to read that damn thing because I want it. And I really kind of look at it as like, I think I look at the title of that book and I expect it to change how people refer to magicians going forward. And it just will become part of the lexicon. It will be called An Unkindness, and another Cat Howardian language trap will have taken us all in, and you will have changed the course of writer culture. That's my expectation.
This is my sole and only goal.
Well, I think you're on your way to it. Kat, thank you so much. I really appreciate having you on here. Thank you for being a part of Fictitious.
Thank you so much. This is a great time.
The home for all things fictitious, including every episode and review, is fictitiouspodcast.com. You can find the show on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook as Fictitious Pod, and you can chat with me directly on Twitter, where I'm at Adrian Buskey. Subscribe to Fictitious on iTunes, Google Play, or Spotify so you don't miss all of my upcoming interviews and reviews, and be sure to check out the previous author interviews exploring the storytelling craft of science fiction and fantasy. I'm Adrian Buskey. Thanks for listening to Fictitious.